The night the silver went missing from Aldermore House, the household gathered in the great hall under 100 candles, and a young woman who had done nothing at all stepped forward to say that she had done it. Eleanor stood in her plain, gray gown, among the gilt and the velvet, her hands folded so tightly that the knuckles had gone white, and she spoke the words clearly enough for every servant and every guest to hear. She said the fault was hers. She said she had taken the candlesticks and the snuff-box and the small chased dish that had belonged to the late Duchess. She did not look at the housekeeper she was protecting. She looked only at the floor, at the worn place in the marble where 1,000 feet had crossed before hers, and she let the room decide what she was. To the assembled company she became, in the space of a single breath, a thief in a borrowed house. The man at the head of the room said nothing. He stood very still, the firelight catching one side of his face, and what moved behind his eyes did not reach his mouth. His name was Julian, the Duke of Aldermore, and he was not a man who was looked at directly, if it could be helped. He had inherited the title, 2 winters past. After a season the county still spoke of in lowered voices, and he had returned to the great house with a silence about him that no one dared to test. He wore his grief the way some men wore their rank as a thing that entered the room before he did. When Eleanor confessed, he might have called for the magistrate. He might have had her put out into the cold November dark, with nothing but the gown she stood in. Instead, he watched her. And the watching was the first thing about that night that did not fit the story everyone in the hall had already begun to tell themselves. You will want to remember this moment, the one where she lied, and he did not believe her, because everything that follows turns upon it. Now let the story go back to its proper beginning. Eleanor had come to Aldermore House in the 3rd week of October, sent by an agency in town to serve as companion to no one in particular, and as an extra pair of capable hands to the housekeeper, Mrs. Selder, Brearley, who had run the place since before the old Duke died. She had not been raised for service. Her father had been a clergyman with a small living and a large library, and he had taught his only daughter Latin and arithmetic, and the quiet pleasures of a well-kept account book, and then he had died owing money to men who did not care that a girl of 23 was left with nothing but his debts and his books. The books were sold. The debts remained. Eleanor took the position at Aldermore because it was offered, and because the alternative was a kind of disappearance. She was not yet ready to choose. She arrived with one small trunk and a face the world had already decided not to look at. Twice Mrs. Brearley took to her at once, which surprised them both. The housekeeper was a broad, brisk woman in her 60th year, with hands swollen at the joints and a memory that held every key and every grievance of 40 years' service. She had been losing the use of those hands by slow degrees, and she had been hiding it, because a housekeeper who could not turn a key or carry a tray was a housekeeper who would be pensioned off to a cottage she did not want and a silence she feared. Eleanor saw the trembling within a week. She said nothing. She simply began to be where Mrs. Howell. Brearley's hands were needed, lifting what could not be lifted, writing the household accounts in her own neat clerk's script while the older woman dictated, so that the ledgers stayed perfect, and no one above stairs ever knew. It was the first costly thing Eleanor did at Aldermore, and she did it for no reward but the keeping of another woman's dignity. She did not know that the house had ways of seeing what was done in its corners. The great house ran on the authority of 2 women, and only one of them drew breath. The living one was the Dowager Duchess of Aldermore, Julian's aunt by marriage, who had taken up residence after the old Duke's death, and had stayed on the strength of her own conviction that the family could not manage without her. Lady Margaret was a handsome woman of 60, who wore her dead husband's consequence like a second set of jewels, and she had decided, within an hour of Eleanor's arrival, exactly what the new companion was, and to the Dowager, Eleanor was a charity case in a clergyman's cast-offs. A girl of no family, pretending to a gentility she could not afford. She said as much to her own maid, in the private aside, that servants are meant not to hear, and always do. The clergyman's orphan, she called her, with a small downward turn of the mouth, as though the words themselves were slightly soiled. She had plans for the house that did not include a sharp-eyed companion writing the accounts in a hand too good for her station, and she had plans for her nephew that did not include his noticing anyone at all. The dowager's plans had a face, and the face belonged to Miss Cassandra Vane. She was the daughter of a baron with a great deal of money and very little land, and she had been brought to Aldermoor for the autumn under the transparent fiction of keeping the dowager company. In truth, she had been brought to be married to the Duke. She was beautiful in the way that diamonds are beautiful, hard and bright and cold to the touch, and she had been told since the schoolroom that she would marry well, and she had arranged her entire person around the certainty of it. When she swept through the morning room in her ice-blue silk, the servants drew back against the walls. She did not see Eleanor at all, which was the cruelest thing she could have done. And she did it without effort every day, simply by looking through the place where the companion stood. Julian saw her, though he gave no sign of it. The Duke kept to his study, and his accounts and the long, solitary rides that took him out before dawn and brought him back gray with cold, and he spoke to almost no one, and the household had learned to leave food at his door and answers unspoken. A great house has corridors of its own, and corridors have corners. And one gray morning in early November, the Duke came down a back passage he rarely used, toward the still-room, and heard a voice reading aloud. He stopped. The voice was low and even, and it was reading something about the campaigns of Caesar and Gaul, translating the Latin as it went into plain, warm English, and there was an old woman's voice answering now and then with a comment or a laugh. He looked through the half-open door. Eleanor sat on a low stool beside Mrs. Bird. Brearley, who lay propped in a chair with a rug over her swollen knees, and the companion was reading to her because the housekeeper's eyes had begun to fail along with her hands, and there was no one in the world whose duty it was to read to a servant. The Duke stood in the cold passage for a long time. He did not announce himself. When he walked away at last, his step was slower than it had been, and something in the set of his shoulders had changed, in a way that no one was there to see. That was the morning he began, against every intention he had formed, to notice her. What he had lost, the household only half knew. 2 winters before, the old Duke's son and heir had married a gentle, laughing woman named Sophia, and Julian, the younger cousin, the spare with no expectation of the title, had loved her with the hopeless decency of a man who keeps his feeling locked in a drawer he never opens. Then came the fever that swept the county that bitter year. The heir died first, and then Sophia 3 days behind him in a sick room. Julian had not been permitted to enter, because he was nothing to her, only the cousin, only the man who watched. He had stood outside a closed door while the woman he loved died on the other side of it, and he had told himself in the long gray aftermath that to be useless to someone in their dying was the worst thing a man could be. The title fell to him like a stone. He kept in the breast of his coat, a small thing he showed to no one, a folded square of paper, a single page in Sophia's hand, the last letter she had ever written him, thanking him for a kindness so small he could no longer remember what it was. He touched it without knowing he did so, a hand brushing the left side of his coat whenever the house pressed too close. That was the wound, and he had built the whole cold architecture of himself around the keeping of it. So, when the Duke began, that November, to find reasons to pass the still room to ask Mrs. Brearley, after her health in a voice no one had heard him use, to inquire of his steward whether the new companion was being properly paid, he did not understand what he was doing. He told himself it was duty. The audience understood it, long before he did. He sent a footman with a better lamp for the still room so that the reading might be easier on the old woman's eyes, and Eleanor received the lamp and did not guess where it had come from, and read by its kinder light, and felt nothing but gratitude to a household she believed indifferent to her. She had been told in 100 small ways that she was a person no one chose. She had folded that belief into herself so completely that she could not have recognized choice if it had stood in front of her and spoken her name. It spoke her name soon enough, though not yet kindly. The first hard blow fell in the long gallery, where the dowager liked to take her exercise among the family portraits, and where one afternoon she came upon Eleanor returning a borrowed book to the library shelves. Lady Margaret stopped. She looked the young woman over from the worn hem of her gown to the ink stain on her right forefinger, and she let the silence stretch until it had weight. Then she spoke, not to Eleanor but to Miss Vane, who walked at her side in rose-colored muslin. It was a wonder, the dowager observed, what the agencies sent these days. The clergyman's orphan put among gentlefolk, as though a good hand with a pen could stand in for blood. Miss Vane laughed a small silver sound, and the two of them walked on, and Eleanor stood among the painted dukes with the book still in her hands, and her face very carefully still. Her cheeks burned. Her breath came short and high in her throat, yet her hands did not shake, and she returned the book to its exact place on the shelf, spine aligned with its neighbors before she walked away. She had learned long ago that the only dignity left to the dismissed was the refusal to let dismissal show. The Duke had come into the gallery from the far end, unseen, in time to hear the dowager's verdict and the rival's laugh. He saw Eleanor's stillness and read it correctly, because he was a man who had spent 2 years perfecting a stillness of his own. He said nothing then. Yet that evening at dinner, when the dowager began upon the subject of the household's economies and suggested, with great delicacy, that a companion who was not strictly necessary might be let go before the expense of winter, the Duke set down his glass. He said that Mrs. Brearley's assistant would remain. He said it in 4 words, flat and final, and he did not explain himself, and the dowager's fork paused in the air, for the length of a heartbeat before she smiled and changed the subject. It was a small thing. It was the first time anyone at Aldermore had defended the companion aloud, and the companion was not there to hear it. She heard of it the next morning from the second footman, who told it to the kitchen as a marvel, and Eleanor turned it over in her mind for a long time, and then put it carefully away with the other things she did not let herself believe. A duke did not defend a servant. There was some reason in it she could not see, some convenience of his own, and she would be a fool to read it as anything else. This was the wound speaking, the old patient voice that had kept her safe by keeping her expectations small. If you have ever been so thoroughly overlooked that kindness began to look like a trap, you will understand her exactly. The story asks only that you keep watching, because she could not yet watch herself. The proximity grew by degrees, the way frost grows on a window invisibly, and then all at once. The Duke took to riding out in the mornings along the eastern field, where the path passed close to the kitchen garden, and Eleanor took to walking there before the house woke because it was the only hour the place felt like her own. They met without meaning to, or so each of them insisted to themselves. He would rein in the great gray horse and look down at her, and she would drop the small curtsy her station required, and they would exchange a dozen words about the weather or the state of the road. And then he would ride on. The dozen words grew to a score, and then to conversations that neither of them named as such, conducted at the edge of a frozen cabbage bed. With the breath smoking between them, he learned that she read Latin and Greek. She learned that he had once meant to study at the university, before the title made such things impossible. He learned that she sent half her small wages to a charity that schooled the daughters of dead clergymen, so that no other girl would be left as unlettered and unprotected as she had nearly been. He did not tell her what hearing that did to him. The next time she saw him, he had brought folded in his greatcoat a book of Greek plays from the Duke's own library, and he handed it down to her from the saddle without a word of explanation, and rode away before she could refuse it. Her body knew before her mind would allow it. She found that she could feel where he was in a room without looking, the way one feels the heat of a fire at one's back. When his horse came up the eastern path, her pulse climbed into her throat, and stayed there. When his gloved hand brushed hers passing the book, the place where they touched stayed warm long after the cold should have taken it. She catalogued these things with the dismay of a woman watching her own careful defenses come down stone by stone, and she told herself they meant nothing, that a man like that could mean nothing by anything he did, and all the while her hands betrayed her, steadying themselves on the garden wall when he rode near. As though the body had decided to believe what the mind refused, he gave the commands of a man who did not know how to ask. "Come in out of the cold," he said when he found her reading on the stone bench past dusk, with her fingers gone blue at the tips. And it sounded like an order, and was in truth a fear. "Eat something," he said to her once in the passage, having noticed that she gave half her supper to Mrs. Brierly, and the words were rough, and the meaning was tender, and Eleanor heard only the roughness, because the tenderness was a language she had never been taught to translate. "Sit down," he told her. On the afternoon she came to the study to deliver the accounts and swayed on her feet from a day with too little in it, and she sat because a duke had ordered it, and he stood over her with something working in his jaw and rang for tea he did not want for her. He watched her drink it. He watched her hand steady around the warm cup, and he did not return to his papers until the color had come back into her face, and when she rose to go he said in the same flat voice that she was to take the accounts more slowly in future, and to eat her dinner before she carried it to anyone else. She said that she would, "Your Grace," in the small, obedient tone she used for orders, and she carried the words down the stairs, turning them over, hearing in them only a master's displeasure at a servant who fainted on his carpet. She did not hear a man who could not bear to watch another person go hungry in his house. The audience heard the protection inside each order. She heard a great man's impatience. The gap between what he meant and what she understood was the engine of the whole long winter, and the dowager, watching from her chair by the fire, began to understand it before Eleanor did, and did not like what she saw. For the dowager had not built her plans on sand. She had a fortune of her own that depended upon the marriage of Cassandra Vane into the family, a private arrangement with the Baron that would settle a great sum upon Lady Margaret's own diminished accounts the day the banns were read. She needed the Duke married to the diamond, and she needed it before the winter ended, and she had begun to notice that her nephew's eyes, which had rested on nothing for 2 years, now followed a gray gown across a room. She tried first the simplest remedy. She arranged for Miss Vane to be everywhere the Duke turned, at the breakfast table and the pianoforte and the foot of the stairs, gowned and jeweled and primed with conversation. The dowager had all but written for her. The Duke endured it with a courtesy so cold it might have warned a cleverer woman than Cassandra. He answered when spoken to. He looked at the fire. And once, when Miss Vane let fall some practiced unkindness about the companion's shabby gloves, the Duke turned his head and looked at her for the first time with his full attention, and what was in his face made the rival fall silent, and the dowager's confidence acquire its first thin crack. The midpoint of that winter brought the night of the Harvest Ball, the first great entertainment Aldermore had given since the old Duke's death, and the dowager meant it to be the night the engagement was understood by the county, if not yet announced. The great hall was opened and lit. 300 candles. The orchestra came from town. The neighborhood arrived in its silks and its diamonds, and Miss Vane descended the stairs in white and silver like a bride rehearsing, and the dowager stood at the head of the room in the place the Duchess would have stood, and surveyed her work. Eleanor was not a guest. She was below stairs with Mrs. Brierly, helping to manage the flood of borrowed footmen and the crisis of the supper, and she had not thought to mind because minding was a luxury she had given up. Late in the evening a message came down that the dowager required her companion in the hall, at once, and Eleanor smoothed her gray gown and went up, not knowing she was walking into a trap that had been 3 weeks in the laying. The dowager had discovered, by the patient means available to a woman who controlled the household keys, that small things had gone missing from the Duchess's old rooms. A snuff-box, a pair of candlesticks, a little chased dish. She had not discovered a thief, because there was none. The things had been moved years ago into a locked cabinet by the old Duke himself and forgotten. Yet Lady Margaret did not need a true thief. She needed a false one, and she had chosen her, and she had laid the missing items where they would be found in the bottom of the companion's own small trunk by a maid instructed where to look. In the bright hall before the assembled county, the dowager raised the matter with every appearance of reluctance. Such a painful thing. The companion, the clergyman's orphan, taken in out of Christian charity, and now this. She had the maid bring down the trunk. She had it opened on the floor of the great hall while the music died, and 300 faces turned. And there, wrapped in Eleanor's own spare shift, lay the silver. Eleanor looked at the thing she had never touched, and she understood, in a single cold instant, exactly what had been done and exactly who had done it. And she understood something else as well. She saw Mrs. Brierly at the edge of the crowd, gone gray with terror because Mrs. Brierly held the keys to those rooms, and Mrs. Brierly's trembling hands had unlocked 100 cabinets over 40 years. And a charge of theft against a servant of 60 with no family and no defense would end not in dismissal, but in a courtroom and a transport ship, and a death at sea. The dowager had aimed at the companion. The trap would spring on whoever could be made to bear it, and Eleanor saw that if she denied it, the inquiry would turn at once to the keeper of the keys. So she made the only choice her values left her. She stepped forward into the silence and the candlelight, and she said that the fault was hers. She said she had taken them. She gave the room the thief it wanted, and she gave it her own name to pin the word to, and she did it to put her body between an old woman and the sea. This is the night the story opened on, and now you stand inside it knowing what the hall did not. The Duke heard her confess. He saw the trunk and the silver and the dowager's face arranged into sorrow, and he saw Eleanor's hands folded white and steady, and he did not believe one word of it. He had watched her give her supper away. He had watched her read Caesar to a failing old woman by a borrowed lamp. He knew, with the certainty of a man who had finally learned to see, that the woman in the gray gown was not a thief, and was lying for someone, and he knew within another breath whom she was lying for because he too had seen how Mrs. Brierly's hands shook. The hall, though, was full, and the accusation was public, and the dowager held the floor, and the Duke understood that a thing done wrong in public cannot be undone in private. So he did the hardest thing. He said nothing yet. He let them take Eleanor to a locked room to await the morning and the magistrate, and he watched her go, and the look that passed between them across the ruined ballroom was the first wholly honest thing that had ever passed between them, and it said, from him, "Wait," and from her, "It does not matter now." The dark hours that followed were the lowest of Eleanor's life. She sat in the cold little room above the stables where they had put her, and she did not weep, because weeping was for people who had something left to lose. She thought of her father and the books that had been sold. She thought of the charity girls she could no longer help. She thought with a strange, clear calm that she had at last done one wholly good thing with her ruined life, and that it would cost her that life, and that the arithmetic of it was sound. And then she thought of the Duke, and the book of Greek plays, and the warmth that had lived in her hand for an hour after his glove brushed it, and for the first time the calm broke, because she found that she did mind, after all, that he would remember her as a thief. That was the thing the dowager had taken from her that she had not counted on losing. Not her freedom, her one chance to be seen truly by the one person who had looked. She did not know that the Duke had not gone to bed. She did not know that he had sent his fastest rider to town in the dark for the family solicitor, a careful elderly man named Mr. Blanks. Hartwell, who had served the Dukes of Aldermore for 30 years and who held in his office strongbox the old Duke's own inventory of the household plate. Signed and dated and witnessed. The rider went out at midnight with a lantern and a sealed note in the Duke's own hand, and the road was bad with frost, and the Duke stood in the stable yard watching the small light dwindle along the eastern field until it was gone. She did not know that he had then gone to Mrs. Bird Brierly's room near the kitchen and sat in the hard chair beside her bed while she wept, and that the old housekeeper had confessed to him through her tears not a theft but the truth. The failing hands she had hidden for 2 years, the companion's silent kindness in writing the ledgers and lifting the trays, the impossibility that Eleanor had taken so much as a pin from anyone in her life. He had listened without interrupting. He had asked her one question only, in a low voice, whether the silver could have been moved from the Duchess's old rooms by anyone but the keeper of the keys and Mrs. Tara. Brierly had told him that those rooms had been locked since before her own time, and that only one other person in the house held a key to them, and that person was the dowager. The Duke had thanked her. He had told her to sleep, and that no harm would come to her, and that she was to say nothing to anyone before morning. She did not know that Julian had gone from there to the window of his study and stood until the sky grayed, one hand pressed flat to the left side of his coat, where a folded letter lay, and had understood at last that the worst thing a man could be was not useless to the dying. It was silent to the living. He had stood outside one closed door already in his life, and let it stay closed. He did not intend to do it twice. He was a stout local squire named Sir Cosmo Penhallow, fond of his own importance and easily steered, and the dowager met him with refreshment and a sorrowful account of the whole sad affair before he had taken off his coat. By 11 the household had been assembled again in the great hall, by daylight this time. The candles cold in their sconces and the room looking smaller and meaner than it had the night before. Eleanor was brought down. She stood where she had stood, in the worn place on the marble, and she kept her eyes on the floor. The dowager spoke. She laid out the discovery of the silver, the companion's own confession before 300 witnesses, the painful necessity of the law. Miss Vane stood at her shoulder and said to the lady beside her, but loudly enough to carry, that she had known from the first that there was something low about the creature, that breeding always told in the end. It was the third time the verdict had been spoken aloud, and this time it was meant to be the last. The magistrate cleared his throat and reached for his papers. The Duke crossed the room. He did not hurry. He came down the length of the great hall in the daylight with every eye upon him, and he stopped beside Eleanor, not in front of her as a protector stands before the weak, but beside her, shoulder to shoulder, as a man stands beside an equal. He turned to the magistrate, and into the silence the whole room was holding. He spoke. "She is to be my wife," he said. 4 words. He let them stand in the air. Then he said the rest, level and clear, that the silver in the trunk was his own household plate, removed years since, to a locked cabinet by his late uncle, as the inventory in Mr. Pess. Hartwell's hand would show, and that it could not have been stolen by anyone because it had never been missing, and that he would be glad to know who had troubled to place it in an innocent woman's trunk, and to lay an accusation that pressed against the wrong servant might have hanged her. He did not look at the dowager when he said it. He did not need to. The whole room looked at her for him. Mr. Hartwell came forward then on the Duke's nod, with the inventory unrolled, and read out in his dry, careful voice the date and the description and the signature of the old Duke, and the squire bent over it and went red and then white. The dowager's hand rose to her throat. She began to speak and found that the sentences would not assemble. The polished phrases that had served her for 60 years fragmented and fell, and what came out was only the broken beginning of an excuse that no one in the room believed. Miss Vane stepped away from her, one small step and then another, the way one steps back from a thing that has caught fire, and the dowager stood quite alone in the place where the Duchess would have stood, and understood that she had lost the house and the marriage and the fortune that had depended on it, all in the space of one short sentence spoken by a man she had thought too broken to fight. The county would have it by nightfall. There was no undoing that. The reversal was complete, and it had cost the Duke nothing but the truth, and it had cost the dowager everything, and the narrator will not pretend to be sorry. Eleanor had not moved. She stood beside him with the daylight on her face, and could not make the words mean what they plainly meant. He turned to her. The whole hall fell away. He said her name simply, the given name no one at Aldermore had used, the name her father had called her by, and the sound of it in his low voice undid something in her that the long night had not been able to touch. He did not make a speech. He had no speech in him. He only looked at her with everything he had spent 2 years refusing to feel, and he said that he had stood outside one closed door in his life and would not do it again, and that if she would have him, no door in this house would ever again be closed against her. And Eleanor, who had taught herself never to want anything she could not have, found that she had been wanting this with her whole starved heart for longer than she had let herself know. and she put her cold hand into his warm one in front of the county and the cooling candles. The dowager left Aldermore within the week, retired to a small property in the north that had come to her in her marriage. With an allowance the Duke settled on her that was neither cruel nor generous, exactly sufficient and not a penny more. Miss Vane was returned to her father with the autumn's purpose unaccomplished, and she married, within the year, a viscount with a larger fortune and a colder house, and was said to be content, which perhaps she was. The magistrate dined out for a month on his small part in the affair, improving his own role with each telling. None of them were destroyed. The house simply closed over the space where they had been the way water closes, and went on. It was Mrs. Brierly who wept longest, and not from sorrow. The old housekeeper had learned in the grey hours of that terrible night what the companion had been willing to spend to keep her safe, and she could never afterward speak of it without her voice failing. The Duke pensioned her, but not to a distant cottage and a feared silence. He kept her at Aldermore in warm rooms near the kitchen, with a girl to do the lifting and her own fire and the run of the still-room, and Eleanor read to her every week of her life that remained, Caesar and the Greek plays and, in the last gentle years, whatever the old woman asked for, which was usually the Psalms. The hands that had trembled were never asked to turn another key. That was the Duke's doing. Quiet and unannounced, and it told Eleanor more about the man she had married than any words he could have found. They were married in the small church on the estate in the week before Christmas, with snow coming down soft and steady past the windows, and a congregation of perhaps 30, the household and the tenants and Mrs. Brierly in the front pew, in a new wool shawl. There was no diamond, no crowd, no county come to gawk. Eleanor wore a gown of soft cream that the Duke had not asked her to wear, and had simply, somehow, arranged to appear. And she carried no flowers because none bloomed in December, and she was the most quietly radiant thing that small grey church had ever held. Julian's hand did not stray to the left side of his coat once. During the service, he had moved the folded letter, that morning, into a small box on the mantel of the room that was now hers as well as his. Not hidden and not displayed. A grief allowed at last to become only memory. A door that could be opened gently and gently closed. That evening, the new Duke and Duchess of Aldermore sat alone by the fire in the small, warm sitting room that Eleanor had chosen over all the grand staterooms of the house, and the snow fell past the dark glass, and a single candle burned on the table between them, though the fire gave light enough. On the mantel sat the little box closed. In Eleanor's lap lay the book of Greek plays he had handed down to her from the saddle, on a cold morning when neither of them had known what was beginning, its spine soft, now with reading, a faded ribbon marking the place where she had left off. She picked it up, she found her line, and in the warm and snow-filled quiet of the house that had decided, at last to see her, she began to read aloud to him in her low, even voice, and he closed his eyes and listened, and the candle burned steady and the long winter outside the glass had no power over the room at all. The house had taken her in as a thief and a charity case and a clergyman's orphan. It would keep her as its own. Thank you for staying to the end of Eleanor's story. If her quiet courage stayed with you, I would be glad to know it. And now I will leave the two of them by the fire, where the snow keeps falling and the reading goes on.